Now that you know what to look for while reading for style, let's try it out with a text that is similar to what you will have to write. Keep this checklist in mind to remind you at each step what we are looking for, and make sure that you have read through the whole text once before beginning to look at stylistic aspects. One of the best ways to make sure you don't miss out on anything is to annotate while you read. That is to say, you mark and jot down key points of what you observe, keeping the checklist at the back of your mind. The text begins, as you can see, with a photograph. In the original, the photographs of the table, 6 chairs, and a space in which they are found occupies an entire page. It is the first thing the reader sees. The title, A Table, 6 Chairs, and a Building, is characterized by simplicity. And if you have already gone through the text once, you will realize that this choice is deliberate. The text replicates in style the same qualities that it appreciates in the pieces of furniture and the building. At the same time, the title does juxtapose the three elements which bring the text together, making the reader wonder how they are connected. And this is precisely the question that moves the text forward. The first line of the text we have seen earlier is important because for us the text has already begun. The first line makes the connection explicit by referring to the photograph and through it introducing the space. With this visual anchored in the reader's mind, we zoom into the furniture. 1 table and 6 chairs, and not much else the writer chooses to tell the reader. It would be enough to say a table and 6 chairs, and yet by emphasizing the fact that there isn't much else, the writer draws attention to an aesthetic choice. The reader will realize its importance later. The first paragraph is not a preamble. It does not talk about the whole text. Rather, it plunges right in with the description of the table. There is logic to the sequence of the description. It moves from the overall dimensions to the tabletop and its frame, the legs and the joints. While looking at each of these, we have details regarding their construction. This is the designer's eye at work. Perhaps not how any user of the table would approach it, but an eye trained to notice how things are made and what effect that has. The writer captures side-by-side elements of the material, form, making, aesthetic, and use, and then brings them together at the end of the paragraph with a return to the overall qualities of the table, and a significant one is that it can pack flat because of the way in which it is put together. The second paragraph uses a short sentence to connect the table of the previous paragraph to the chairs, which will be the focus of the description. The connection is made through the description of the position of the chairs around the table and then continues with the similarity of the material used. The writer could have said, "The chairs are made of timber," but once a text provides one set of details, good writing returns to these to compare. The chairs are also then described in a logical sequence, starting from the broader, that is the frame, and going down to the narrower aspects, that is the joints. The overall structure of the chairs is introduced in the last sentence through the impact it has on the use. The third paragraph, unusually and maybe unwisely long, departs from the idea of making and introduces the room as a third element to the comparison. Note the line, "The dining table and the chairs occupy a space that seems to fit like a glove." Then the same descriptive sequence is followed for the room. We move from the overall dimensions to the ceiling, floor, and walls, and this is where the writer decides that we have sufficient pertinent information and we do not need more for the point of the text to make sense. The final part of the paragraph brings in a new idea. Ideally, this should be a different paragraph. The idea is that in spite of an apparent similarity, the three items do not in fact belong to the same school of thought or design movement, and yet there is something that connects them in spite of that. This is the point where key questions of the text are raised. What makes them seem to belong together? How do they transcend the limits of time? The final part of the paragraph brings in a new idea. Ideally, this should be a different paragraph. The idea is that in spite of an apparent similarity, the three items do not in fact belong to the same school of thought or design movement, and yet there is something that connects them in spite of that. This is the point where key questions of the text are raised. What makes them seem to belong together? How do they transcend the limits of time? The fourth paragraph does not stretch the point any longer, but rather jumps right into putting an answer into words. The three speak the same language, but this answer needs to be made explicit. The reader cannot read the writer's mind, and so the following paragraphs will need to define this language to which we have just been introduced. And right enough, the fifth paragraph gives us the first characteristic of the style and therefore the language of design that the writer has been talking about. It is robustness. Note how the quality is introduced. Robust is a word that GU uses frequently. It is not a quality that the writer has named, but one that has come from the designer. The writer then goes on to explain it with specific reference to the chairs. Think of the difference between this explanation and a plain description of the chair that could have said, "The chairs are robust." That would communicate something as well, but not nearly as much as this analysis. The next two paragraphs introduce two more qualities. One brought in again as a word GU uses, the other introduced differently. The design of the chairs is honest. Even here, the meaning of this choice of word usage is immediately explained. Think by comparison of how carelessly we often use words like minimalist, to a point where it does not mean anything anymore. The text makes sure that the words it uses are clear and appropriate and easy for the reader to understand. In the 8th and the 9th paragraphs, we have two more ways of introducing qualities. GU refers to some materials as noble and generous when applied to the design of furniture. These are close enough in meaning to the previous ways of introducing the language of the style for the connection to be clear. At the same time, they do not use the same syntax, that is, they do not follow the same sentence structure, else the reader is likely to be bored and lose interest. The last two paragraphs of the text do two things. They pull together the qualities of GU's style and explain what makes them into a language that he has developed over time, the concept of riyas. And then they remind the reader that we are not here to discuss just GU's design language. We arrived at this point because we raised a question about what held the chairs, the table, and the room together. What was that timeless quality that allowed them to appear so similar? The last line of the concluding paragraph is a delicate touch. We spoke about past, present, and future in the text. As we reach the end, it is with a glance at the future that we depart, that is both nostalgic and hopeful. By the end of the text, if you have gone through it pen in hand, you will have a clear idea of both content and structure, which you can represent like this to make it easier to see how it functions. You have also noticed the way language is used, looking for the right word, explaining concepts through simple sentences. The references to designers and users, as well as the way in which the language does not take knowledge for granted, make it clear that the text is intended not only for a designer, but also for various other people to read. The first paragraph, with its reference to beams and battens, may seem somewhat difficult for someone not familiar with these terms, but even they would be able to follow the overall meaning and understand what the description of the table intends to emphasize. There is, of course, much more that we could observe and learn. For now, though, this should be enough. The next logical step is to look at these strategies the writer has used and to identify some to use in your own description. Or you could try to do a reading for style on your own, using another text and see what more you can learn and practice.